in 2021. Now is the time we must do a video about these two things. Hey, listen, folks. Today I'm here to talk to you about the difference between sickles and hand scythes. They're very similar tools. Let's start with the sickle. Sickle and circle have the same cognate in ancient languages, so same. Now, as I was talking, I forget her name. I'll have to look it up. I'll put it here-ish. Her name, newer channel, I should say. And she had done a video about sickles and how Hector Paulus Meyer, was it Paulus Hector Meyer? I can't remember which way it goes. Anyway, Meyer's manual has a section Exotica, which deals with odd weapons that are kind of considered peasant weapons, like the peasant cudgel, which is basically a small tree, and the sickle and the scythe, and things that you're kind of questioning whether they actually used for weapons in the day or not. Maybe way back, maybe some in his time period, but I think mostly my theory is that he put in there to say, hey, look, I can teach you anything. See, I'm a great master. Come to me and not these other bozos who only teach sword and knife. I mean, what happens if you don't have one? You know, probably just hype. And also to show off his money, or whoever was paying for this book, because let's face it, books were expensive, and if you include a whole section that's kind of unnecessary, it's kind of like saying, look how much money I have. I am important. So that's my kind of interpretation of that. Mine is very much a farming sickle, as it is perfectly round handle, slightly flared to keep your hand from flying off, but it's not going to give you edge alignment. When using to cut grass, the reason for this offset blade, we'll talk about that for a second, is that if you're holding and cutting low to the ground, you see the blade can go right up next to the ground and your hand will still be above the ground. So you can cut very close to the ground level. I don't know if mice, but most ones I've seen are just right with the handle. So they have to cut further up and you leave stalks. I don't know. The hole is there just to hang it on a wall, which I don't like because it does actually put a weak point in the blade, but I bought this one for a couple bucks at a flea market. So just to play around with, it's fine. Now, I was mentioning to the lady in question during her videos that mine had this offset blade. And like I said, that's for getting close in. And when you're holding it close up, I imagine your finger goes here, and you can feel the edge very well, and the finger fits nice and comfy right in there. At least mine does, for doing like this motion. As far as a weapon, if I was to use this one, now you notice the blade is not over and then up. It's over and then cantered back. So the point, even though my blade has kind of a bend to it, the point is more or less in line with the handle itself. So if you're doing a piercing attack with the tip, it's not out of alignment with your hand, just the blade kind of curves out some. But the reason I think this is nice in if you were to use it for defense is that it kind of gives, if you're holding high up, kind of gives a little bit of deflection away from the knuckles, where the blade was pure center, so when it hits and the blade skated down and go right into your knuckles. So I had mentioned in her video that there's a difference between sickles and hand scythes. Now, hand scythes often in modern times get called sickles, but they look like this. Much more like an oriental kama, like an Okinawan kama. Let's sickle down for a second. This one has a very, very thin blade. And it's fairly flexible. Not too much, but fairly. And it is essentially looks like a little miniature Grim Reaper scythe. That's a short handle. The handle, as you can tell, is thicker this way than this way. Oh, thicker with the blade than without. Now, in a sword, you'd want it where the thin part goes with the blade for edge alignment. But in this case, it is turned so that the when you hold it, thin side inside your hand like you do a sword, the blade goes off to the side. And that's very inconvenient if you're using it as a weapon because it feels like it's not in the right direction. But using it as a tool, that is the right direction. So that's why the handle is thicker going this way than this way versus the blade. Now, what other differences are there besides shape? I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure why you choose this over this. And this is not, of course, the only design of hand scythes. There are some that have metal handles that come like swooping down and the blade goes out closer to what a full-size scythe looks like. So why choose one of these to harvest with instead of one of those? I'm not sure. Perhaps it's sickles cut certain, like for bundles of wheat or something. If you're cutting wheat, maybe that's why you'd want this, because it would kind of scoop all the grain into this area while you're cutting. And maybe you need a wider scythe type blade for thicker grasses, maybe, or stalks. Like, I mean, these existed before, but let's say in North America, we're cutting down corn stalks. You may need a thicker, heavier blade to cut through those, perhaps. Hand size, obviously this style especially, is very similar to the Oriental Kama, whereas the sickle is not so similar. And a lot of people think they're just that the sickle was used in Europe and the Middle East and Kamas were used in the Orient, but actually both these tools were used in Europe and in the Americas and other places that Europeans traveled. But I like this because most people have never heard of a hand scythe, or not heard it called that. They may have seen one and just called it a sickle, but it's not, even though it gets called that modern times. Now, could you use this like this if you were practicing mire? Somewhat. There are some techniques with this, especially the hooking, that might not go so well with this one, or not work the same. But I think you could adapt the techniques. Could you use a two-handed scythe techniques with this? To a degree. The same way if you're using, say, a long sword, and you take your backhand off and just do the same techniques as you would with a long sword, you can use a single-handed sword that way. There are some things that don't work as well, such as, in Italian this would be finestra sinestro, right? That doesn't work so well with single-handed. I've seen it done in some sources, I think, especially with side sword, but it's a weaker position without the backhand there to stabilize it. So, and also you often are using a shield with a single-handed sword. So that wouldn't be very good with a shield, I don't think. And by itself, parrying this way, you pretty much could drop the sword rather easily. So I would not recommend that either. But obviously, the technique for longsword developed out of single-handed sword. So backstepping it like that and then taking out the techniques that don't really work well seems like a fair method for reconstruction. Whereas if you had one of these, which did exist in Europe, I don't know how far back they go, but certainly did, and you wanted to use it like in an authentic manner and looked at mire, you could adapt between the sickle and scythe probably and make something work with this. Likewise, of course, if you were into Oriental martial arts, Kama techniques would work with a hand scythe pretty well. You know, I've also heard people reconstruct, or not reconstruct, but kind of make a method for Native American tomahawk fighting using the methods of Kama. Interesting. They do, when you think about it, kind of function similar. One pierces, the other chops, but kind of the same. And there was a lesser type of tomahawk called a sheep's foot tomahawk, which is basically a spike, kind of like a spontoon tomahawk, but instead of the arrow, like broadhead, it's more of a pick shape with the bottom sometimes sharpened. So, yeah, I guess you could do that. I think if you do that kind of stuff, you should be honest about where you get your techniques and not say, oh, this is authentic Native American or something. But if you're trying to make a method that works for something that doesn't seem to exist, fair enough. So that's a little comparison between sickle and hand scythe and the differences between. Hilson, and good night, folks.